Tonight, protesters across the country still out in force, speaking out, of course, against the grand jury's decision, the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown. The protest sparking a response on the national level from the president and attorney general. This as the nation awaits a decision much closer to home. It's expected to come down this week in the death of Eric Garner. Tonight, we take a look at the racial divide in the country as it pertains to communities, police forces, and yes, the justice system. And the St. Louis Rams bring their protests against the Ferguson decision to the field. This isn't the first time we've seen politics and civil rights issues make their way onto the athletic arena, but the question is, should they? Plus, Ashton Carter expected to be named President Obama's nominee for Chuck Hagel's job. Who is he, and does he have what it takes here to divide or bring the divide across the table? Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, we are discussing a number of issues as they pertain to the fury that came out of Ferguson, Missouri, and obviously some of the outstanding questions that we may be dealing with much closer to home. And speaking of that, we, as always, want you to be a part of our program. So please, right now, we're opening up our toll-free phone lines. You see the number on your screen, 888-766-2428. You can also share your thoughts with us online as well. We'll get to both tweets as well as your comments via Facebook in this program as well, as we weigh in on the racial divide that this case has certainly highlighted. Police, community relations, justice system, your perspective at home is certainly welcomed. Now, people protesting the grand jury's decision not to indict Officer Wilson, they're not letting up here. Protests, they've continued for yet another day, and the race gap that this case has shed a light on, that's difficult for anybody to deny. Take a look at these numbers. Huffington Post, YouGov poll showed the difference. Now, this was taken before the decision even came down. It shows that, as I said, nearly 2/3 of blacks and only basically 1 out of 5 whites believe that Officer Wilson should have faced criminal charges in Michael Brown's death. And 31% of whites compared to 74% of blacks believe that Wilson's use of deadly force is part of a broader pattern. And on Monday, the president, he called for $75 million to aid to help police departments buy body cameras. The president also announced a new task force when it comes to community police relations. And the Attorney General, Eric Holder, also weighed in, speaking out about the unrest, saying this is not a problem limited to Ferguson, Missouri.
But the problems we must confront are not only found in Ferguson. The issues raised in Missouri are not unique to that state or to that small city. We are dealing with concerns that are truly national in scope and that threaten the entire nation.
It violates my belief in what America can be, to hear young people feeling marginalized and distrustful even after they've done everything right.
Those statements from President Obama and Eric Holder come as the nation awaits a decision in the death of Eric Garner. 43-year-old Mr. Garner died on Staten Island over the summer, captured on video. That after being put in a chokehold by an NYPD officer for allegedly selling loose cigarettes on the streets of Richmond County. All right. A lot to get into. We're going to break this into different conversations, but remember, you're going to keep showing that toll-free number. We're going to get to your phone calls here throughout this hour, but let's bring in our panel right now. Reverend Dr. Thomas Nins, he is the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Greenwich, Connecticut. Reverend Nins also serves as the chaplain of the Greenwich Police Department and is a diversity outreach coordinator at Brunswick, and he's certainly got a fascinating perspective, I think, on this one. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, has covered a lot of high-profile cases relating to both police and communities of color. We're going to certainly be talking with Dominic about expectations for what we can see as early as this week coming out of Staten Island. Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent, has been getting the pulse coming out of Washington on this one, as well as also following some of the bigger news that even goes beyond this. All right. And we'll also be joined by another guest shortly in the program. But first of all, Reverend, thank you for joining us. And I'm curious from your perspective as somebody who deals with the police community, has, I'm sure, had some interesting sermons and conversations with your congregants, both over Thanksgiving and really since the Ferguson decision became part of the national consciousness. The divide that we see, depending on the populations you're talking about, is it really obvious that two different groups of people can look at the same incident and walk away with a completely different perspective on where we are as it relates with race and justice and law enforcement in this country?
First, thank you for having me on the show. I'm honored to be here and with our panelists, and the answer is yes. It is absolutely possible with two groups of people to look at the same incident and walk away with different feelings, because those groups of people are comprised of individuals who have had their own experiences and approach these experiences from their own narrative and their own philosophy and their own interpretation. And tragically, this incident polarizes. Rather than creating opportunities to come together, it has amplified divisions that already existed prior to this.
And to that end, Dominic, you know, we're going to talk about it a little bit later as the issue of sports and this play into it, but it was fascinating to me, the reaction out of the St. Louis Police Department when they saw those players throw their hands up in the don't shoot position, and the palpable frustration in communities. Some of the bars and the restaurants and whatever wouldn't even show the games anymore. But yet you go not too far down the road and then you see what's playing out still in the streets, not just of Ferguson and St. Louis. Those poll numbers showed it. The same thing. Even in living color, we're going to see this, I think, happen in you know, Staten Island. Different people, not bad people, but different people looking at the same situation and life experiences coloring what they think this is all about.
You know, Richard, that's a great question, and I don't think I could answer it any better than the way the pastor just did when you think about this. And it's interesting to listen to him because I've been to his church before, and to see that he has a congregation that is white and African American, and he's calling it the way he sees it. But it's all based on what perceptions we bring to this coming in. Those football players in St. Louis, they come from communities of color, basically like the community I grew up in, housing projects and so on. And so they have their perception of the police. And they also have sons, they're professional football players, but their sons have to go out into the community, their daughters into the community, just like anybody else. Then you brought up the police officers. Pastor did as well. That's an interesting perspective, because to the police unions in St. Louis, they can't understand why anyone would do that. From their perspective, a grand jury has cleared Officer Wilson, so why would you inflame the situation? So again, perceptions from each side. And that's going to happen now in New York City with the Garner case that's coming down in all likelihood before the end of the week. The perception that you bring to police and community.
But that covers the perception of individual incidents, the Garner case or the case in Ferguson. One of the poll numbers that we talked about indicated that people think that there's a systemic problem here, that there's a pattern that lives out here. And I suspect that there's probably a differentiation from those different communities as to whether a pattern exists, which really seems to be the bigger issue, because these stories keep popping up. And I'm curious, Reverend, if you get a sense from the different communities you serve, whether there's a different perspective in whether there's a systemic problem.
That's a great question. I think the answer is absolutely yes. For those who have felt marginalized, for those who feel disenfranchised, for whatever reasons they feel that way, they view it as the result of a system that has waged war against them. For those who feel included, for those who feel part of the mainstream, for those who feel like we have progressed so much as a nation, they also have that mindset. The tension and the acceleration of all of this angst is that rather than look for ways to find real paths to progress, we cling almost fondly to those belief systems that we bring into this situation. And so you have people with a line between them. And sometimes the people have drawn the line where there was none.
Well, your congregation, overwhelmingly, if not entirely, people of color, right? And a lot of them
Majority.
Have made it, right? So we're not talking about, you know, some of the communities that haven't, you know, been able to break through. But yet I'm curious, how many of them still have that talk with their son to say, respect authority, but you know what? You don't look, you put your hands in the wheel, you do the following. Does that talk still happen, even in the Greenwiches of the world?
Let me say this, that I, as a father of two sons, have that talk with my sons, as my father had that talk with me. But it's not a talk out of fear, and it's not a conversation birthed out of resentment. It's about respect. It's about clear lines of authority. It's about helping our children, our community, to navigate, sometimes through cloudy waters. And so those conversations should happen, but I don't know.
Let's be honest. If I was your son's age,
yes,
you wouldn't have to tell me about the talk, right?
I would. Have to is different. Choose to, yes, I would choose to. Because it's imperative that we understand when we're talking about law enforcement, and we're talking about the police side of the legal justice system, one of the mistakes that we commonly make as a people, we think that if there's a traffic stop and we are asked to show proof of identity, that it's a request. It's not really a request. It is a command. It is a direct instruction. And there are certain things you do when you have a direct instruction. And so where it gets cloudy is when you introduce race or class into that conversation.
Well, we've got a fascinating snippet of what Charles Barkley had to say. And it's not about the sports, but it's about the police and the relationship. And I'm really curious what our guests, and a guest will be joining us shortly also, have to say about that. And I know I asked you to call in, and I know you have, so we're going to get to your phone calls when we come back after the break. If you haven't joined us, please do so. You see the number. We'll bring in your reaction as well. Stay with us, everybody. RFL continues after this.